Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final lecture of Chapter 26. We are in Lecture 3, Part 2, and this is going to complete the entire chapter and section on the urinary system. Now, don't be fooled just because it was only 3 lectures, and don't be fooled just because it was only 2 parts, that it's over and easy. You need to practice and review the main points of each of these steps. So one of the more complex sort of chapters, even though it's a little bit shorter, there's still a lot of details that you need to kind of work out and practice. So stay on top of it. But we are at the final site, so we are going to move on to the urine transport. We, of course, have the ureter, we have the bladder to discuss, and then we have the urethra. And that's where really what we're working on. And we have some minor histology to get through. So let's get into this. But one quick thing I like pointing out is if you notice, there's the 11th and 12th ribs. So notice those floating ribs are kind of the final protection to the kidney, which is why you don't want shots to the back of the back and lower back region and the lumbar region, because of course you have your kidneys there, which of course are vital organs that you certainly don't want damaged. So let's get into this. Let's wrap this up here. As you can see, we're in the second part, and so we're really just pathway of urine travel, getting into anatomy and histology of the bladder, histology of the urethra, comparison male-female. So we're going to be getting through quite a few things here just to wrap this up, but it is on the shorter side. Fortunately, we're wrapping up with a short lecture to close out. All right, so I've already pointed out this image, knowing that the kidneys are kind of hidden just anterior to the 11th and 12th rib there. But what I really like about the image, you can see the minor calyx to major, minor to major. And so we know that this is a major calyces. You got minor, minor, minor into a major, and then these majors end up becoming the renal pelvis right here, which leads to the ureter. All those things you should be able to identify and recognize. So some key concepts there, but we're moving on to the next step. So after the kidney, where does urine move into? And of course, we've basically at this point know it's collecting duct to the minor calyx, to the major calyx, to the renal pelvis, and then eventually to the ureter. Now, to be clear, when I label up for my class, when I label up the ureter, it's going to be somewhere down here. If I'm within the kidney and I'm labeling up kind of a funnel-shaped region, it is definitely the renal pelvis. Okay, so if it's within the kidney, it's the renal pelvis, and that's usually how I label it. The ureter, I'm going to label pretty far away. There won't be a confusing label where it's like, is this the renal pelvis or ureter? If you're thinking that, it's renal pelvis. Ureter is going to be very clear. All right, but you should know the ureter is the next section, and of course, I can expand on this previously, starting as early as the renal corpuscle. So keep that in mind. My students, really, you should know at this point that I like travel, like the path of travel. So with urine formation, where does it start and where does it end? And so if you list everything, that's the renal corpuscle, the PCT, the nephron loop, the DCT, collecting duct, minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, ureter, and that's kind of where we're at. All right, with the ureter, you should know it's approximately 12 inches long. If you've ever had a kidney stone, it's really painful when it moves through the ureter. So it's the ureter that you actually feel it. And so anatomically, it's not hard to describe a ureter. The tubule that conducts urine from kidney to bladder, not really that difficult to describe. So be able to describe that way. And it has 3 histological layers. And so when we look at this, this is one of the harder histologies because it's going to look very similar to the urethra, but I'm going to point out the major differences that you have to pay attention to. And if you pay close attention, you should be able to see these major differences. All right, so there's 3 histological layers. You always know I really, really like testing on the epithelial layer. So when it comes to the ureter, you need to know that it's transitional epithelium. All right, so that's the mucosa, transitional epithelium. And when we combine that with the loose connective tissue, which is areolar connective tissue, we get that as lamina propria. So the mucosa, you definitely should know the epithelial layer is transitional epithelium. And then, of course, membranes, because this is a mucous membrane. Membranes need the connective tissue. That's the lamina propria, is the connective tissue side. Again, lamina propria is not epithelial tissue. It's part of the mucosa. This is strictly the epithelial tissue. So when I ask, what is the epithelial of the ureter? It's transitional. Now, notice that the middle layer is the muscular layer, and we can see that right there. Smooth muscle, that's the middle layer, is the middle muscular layer. So that's what you should know about it. And it's still consisting of our typical longitudinal bands and circular bands of smooth muscle. Again, it's the inner circular and then the outer longitudinal band. You should know that it's going to be the peristaltic contractions that's going to move urine forward, as well as the semen in the case of males. Okay. And then the third layer that we have is the serosa layer, like we're usually seeing it. Obviously, there was the exception with the esophagus having adventitia, but in this case, we are dealing with the outer connective tissue layer, which is going to be the serosa, and that's going to be continuous with the actual capsule and within the peritoneum. Again, terms that I don't tend to use. If you take it in advanced sort of anatomy, they start talking about the peritoneal cavity a lot more than I am in this case here. All right, but the main point is you should be able to identify this as the ureter. You should know that ureter is what links or carries the urine from bladder to kidney. And then you should know its layering. And then, so when we look at this, how does the ureter differ in histology compared to the urethra? Well, if you notice here, here's the urethra. The main difference is notice how thick this lamina propria is. It's containing mucus cells, so it's a lot thicker. It's a lot darker in color. And that's really the big difference that you have to pay attention to because the urethra, if you notice, is surrounded here. There's the smooth muscle. And then we're kind of done where the ureter is within the body there. So we're not going to have the same sort of setup. But the big giveaway is notice the density of the lamina propria in comparison. Notice how dense it is, how dark it is. When we hop back here, notice the lamina propria is pretty non-existent. It's a really small little layer here, not very thick. It's not glandular. And that's how you're going to have to tell the difference. Now, typically for me, I usually do those as extra credit questions, comparing and contrasting them. So just keep that in mind. But, you know, there are a few good layers on here that hands down I feel are fair game. But this transitional epithelium is the other giveaway. So notice this is really transitional. It's very, very thick layers. When we go over to here, notice it's not that thick when you compare it to the actual lamina propria. So thin epithelium and a very thick lamina propria. Here we have a pretty thick epithelium, about the same size as lamina propria. So that's how you're going to have to tell the differences. They are fair game, but often I try to do them as extra credit, but definitely expect you to be able to recognize these. Definitely no transitional epithelium. Now, the urine gets transported to what organ does the urine get transported to? Of course, you should know that that's going to get transported to the bladder, and so that's the bladder here. And notice the bladder does have these ridges, and notice they're called rugae. So those are all common things that I expect students to be able to recognize. Now, it's a hollow muscular organ, can store approximately 1 liter of urine. Okay, and again, we form about 2 liters a day. So minimally, most people would have to go at least twice a day. But obviously, that's relative to your sensitivity to the fullness of your bladder. Now, the bladder, still transitional epithelium, which you hands down need to be able to recognize. Now, notice when it comes to this sort of histology, there is really no luminal space. I would be showing you this whole big area here. So you'd have a lot of open space between it. And usually this one I tend not to test on. Of all of them, this would be the most likely candidate for extra credit, while the other two, the ureter and urethra, would probably be the most likely candidate for fair game questions for me to test on. All right, but some of the key things is you should be able to recognize this. I have a model in the classroom that looks very similar to this. In fact, it has the prostate gland, so you know that this is a male's bladder. And the reason I know that is females don't have the prostate gland. So this has to be a male's urinary system that we're tracking in this case. All right. Has internal folds, rugae. You should know the rugae is there. It will disappear when it folds, when it starts to get full, because when it fills up, it stretches the walls and those walls thin out. Okay. Now, one of the main muscles that you need to know, you need to recognize, it's the detrusor muscle. And it's a very common question. It's very simple. The detrusor muscle is related to which of the following organs, or the muscle found within the walls of the urinary bladder are known as. Okay, so know the detrusor muscle. It's pretty much a definition. Now, with the model, you should notice we have this little triangular shape, and the model in the classroom looks exactly like this. This area, this funnel, is only forming on this side because that's where the ureters, so this is the ureteral openings, and that forms this sort of triangular shape. That's called the trigon. I almost always label this. So definitely know this structure. So you should know rugae, you should know trigon, you should know that there's the ureteral openings here. You should know there's the ureter up there. Those things should be easy to identify. And then when you come down here, notice you do have your actual prostate gland here. So you should be able to recognize that. All right, and so notice this layer, we do have a submucosa. So this does consist of a submucosa. Now, again, the muscularis layer, or the muscularis externa, you should know is the detrusor muscle. And notice two longitudinal bands in one circular muscle. So a little bit unique. That's why you need to know the detrusor muscle quite a bit. And if I describe which of the following smooth muscles consist of two longitudinal bands and one circular band, definitely make sure you can recognize it as the detrusor. Okay. Like I said, histology is not usually the main focus, but the big focus is definitely knowing some of this anatomy here and being able to describe it, and then definitely transitional epithelium. And so this brings us to the urethra, and here you can see it's a female urethra. But again, notice as far as the epithelial, notice it's a lot thinner compared to the lamina propria. It's a lot larger of a lamina propria there, and that's how you can tell the difference between the urethra versus the ureters. Very challenging. It's one of our more advanced histology images. Usually I save this sort of histology stuff for the lab exam there. Okay. But when it comes to urethra, know that this is the final transport here, where it's actually going to transport urine from the bladder to the actual external environment, and that's how we get rid of, of course, urine. Now, notice we still continue our normal histology where we do have a submucosa. So one of the big differences that you should note is that the ureter lacks a submucosa. That was really the major point and the main difference there, where this does actually have a submucosa. Okay. But notice the actual mucosal layer, it does change. It's transitional epithelium early on in the neck region of the urethra, which is early on, and that slowly shifts to stratified columnar at the kind of midpoint, and then it eventually becomes stratified squamous at the urethral orifice. Okay, and we still have the lamina propria on there, and we know that it's a lot denser in this region here. But again, just know that the layers here, we're dealing with a mucosa, a submucosa, a muscularis, and a serosa layer. Now, again, when it comes to the muscularis layer, if I'm describing a urethral sphincter, we got the word urethra with an L on there. All right, you should know the internal urethral sphincter, just like the internal anal sphincter, you should know is involuntary, which makes it smooth muscle. And then just be aware the external anal sphincter, the external urethral sphincter is considered voluntarily controlled, and that's going to be skeletal muscle. So definitely be able to recognize that. And so the muscularis layer here is definitely the concentric rings of smooth muscle, and it's very specific to the urethral sphincter, where the external urethral sphincter, make sure you understand that that is specifically skeletal muscle. And so overall, when we talk about urination, the reflex that controls it, it's called the micturition reflex. No, this is a definition. It's a straightforward term. It's a straightforward definition on the exam. It's one of those things that kind of tells me which students listened to the exam versus which did not. So the urination is controlled by the micturition reflex. And on the exam, guess what? I have a urination reflex on there, and it's definitely not that. So make sure you know this definition. That's the extent you need to know it. And you should know that the sensory receptors are really, as the bladder fills, we're relying on those baroreceptors or stretch receptors that continue to change that rugae. If you remember, the bladder's filled with rugae. As that rugae starts to disappear, it puts more stress or more pressure down, and that's what's going to stimulate the parasympathetic motor neurons to send signals to the brain, and that's going to trigger their micturition reflex to eventually allow us to, of course, relax the external sphincter. That's where our voluntary control is. We control this portion consciously, and then this is what, of course, once we send the signals, this will eventually allow the internal urethral sphincter to function. Interestingly, the outermost layer is known as the visceral peritoneum, so you should know that. That's the serosa and the serous layer here. Like I've been stressing, really knowing the travel and where it's located is the main point, and focusing on the epithelial. Here, I do have a couple things like micturition reflex, and then knowing internal versus external urethral sphincters, which is voluntary, which is involuntary. And again, if it's involuntary, you know it's smooth muscle. If it's voluntarily controlled, you should know that that's definitely going to be skeletal muscle. All right, and then that brings us to this figure here, and these figures are going to be repeats when we get to the urinary system. So it's worth studying these figures. It's worth knowing them. Um, and so I would really have a decent understanding here. And here they're showing you the peritoneum, which is the lining of the serous membrane, right? It's the, in this case, this is the parietal layer, parietal peritoneum. And you can see at this point when it's covering the organ, it would be the visceral peritoneum. All right, but here we're going to compare the differences. And so when we talk about the urethra differences, you should know males are approximately 8 inches long because it starts just immediately after the bladder in both cases. So here's the female bladder and there's the urethra. It's a lot shorter. Here's the male bladder and it ends up going through the penile tissue. And so in the males, you need to be able to recognize that there's the prostatic urethra. And usually on an exam, I put 2 arrows and I usually give you a context clue of like identify this tubular structure, identify this pathway that's being pointed at by both arrows. In this case, this is the prostatic urethra, where if you notice here, when we look at the vas deferens, and I'll again point these things out when we get to the male reproductive system, but notice when that comes into this region, it goes through the prostate. This is all connected to essentially the testes or the gonads, right? And so when it's connected here, this is going to be considered your ejaculatory duct. So this is the ejaculatory duct, which will dump this sperm into the actual urethra, where here, this prostatic urethra is strictly for urine. Okay, ejaculatory duct is for sperm. All right, and then eventually you should note right here, this is where the urogenital diaphragm is. That's basically what stops our body from having an open space between separating our pelvic region from our legs. As we know, that area is closed off, and that's closed off by the urogenital diaphragm. And right here, the urethral part is considered the membranous urethra. So right there, that's the membranous urethra for males, and you should know that. All right, so between the urogenital diaphragm. And then finally, we got the spongy urethra. That's in the actual spongy tissue of the penile tissue. And we're going to learn a little bit on the reproductive side that this is called the corpus spongiosum, hence spongy urethra, spongiosum. All right, so a lot of these structures you're going to need to know: the seminal gland, the prostate gland, the bulbal urethra. These are all things that we're going to be covering. Okay, so get familiar with this image. It's worth studying. It's worth reviewing. Should be one of the easier lab exams. Again, we're focused just straight up on these male reproductive organs versus female. Now, with females, you should note that the urethra is approximately 1.5 inches long, and it only carries urine, where the male, of course, carried urine and sperm, which is why I was stressing the ejaculatory duct here versus the prostatic urethra. All right, but urine only, and it's slightly anterior to the vagina. So you can see the vagina is a little posterior to the urethra right there. Who's more prone to UTIs and why? So this is a question you should think about, and you should know this answer. It tends to be something I often ask on this lecture exam here. But females tend to be more prone because of the urethra being so short, so the path of travel to actually reach the bladder and start causing an infection is quite short in comparison, where the male system has all this route to go just to get all the way up to the bladder. Plus the prostate gland, the bulbal urethral gland, and the seminal gland, they actually all produce things that protect the sperm, and a lot of that means it helps clean the urethra. So the male urethra actually gets cleaned through these extra glands. So that's why females tend to be more prone. It's really the short distance, but also the accessory glands that males have that keep the urethra clean. All right. I do expect you to know that urine is going to move by peristalsis. And again, it's parasympathetic stimulation because, of course, rest and digest. You know, if you were scared and frightened, it'd be really, really hard to consciously go to the bathroom. I know you can get, you know, people talk about getting scared and having accidents. That's a little bit different than what I'm talking about. Like if you were trying to run away from somebody, the last thing you're going to be thinking about is going to the bathroom, which, of course, makes urination a parasympathetic activity. It's a rest and digest side, so definitely note that. All right, and then kind of closing out the chapter here, we can talk about the waste that our body produces. I expect you to know the main waste, which we've already talked about. You should definitely know is hands down urea. And we know that urea is that byproduct of the deamination process, right? In fact, it's so important that you should know that I ended up highlighting in it and putting it in different colors. So definitely know urea is the main waste. But we also have a couple other ones. We have creatinine, okay, and that's what gets measured if you remember when we talk about measuring kidney health. There's a measure of creatinine levels. And that's just the byproduct of breaking down creatine phosphate. Sometimes it ends up getting converted to creatinine, which we have to get rid of. So that's the second main one. And then the final one is uric acid, and that's a result from recycling of nitrogenous bases of RNA. So RNA, as it breaks down, ends up producing uric acid. So know these different wastes. Hands down, know urea is number one, then creatinine, and then uric acid. So I expect you to know these, and I expect you to know where these waste products get produced from. So this is really why we produce urine. Otherwise, our waste is, of course, removed by in the form of feces, right? So this is our metabolic waste and how we remove it as far as a toxin goes. All right. And then finally, we kind of close out. So this is just straight up knowing this. Don't miss these. These are really easy. They're definitions. And then these are, again, continuing with renal problems. These are straight definitions as well. So when we talk about incontinence, which tends to happen as we age, but as you age, losing the ability to control urination voluntarily. Okay. And so that's just common with aging because your smooth muscle starts to lose its elasticity and its strength. And so ability to control urination starts to go down because you're not controlling those urethral sphincters. Urinary tract infections, UTI, obviously that just means some sort of infection of the urinary tract. Definitely not pleasant to deal with. You can feel the burning in the kidneys. You can feel the burning in essentially the urethra regions. So not really fun to deal with in many cases. But like I said, more common in females due to the shorter tract. Renal calculi, that is the anatomical term for kidney stones, right? And they form in the urinary tract. It's hard granules of calcium, sometimes can be magnesium salts, or even uric acid, so breaking down mRNA too much. Um, Usually, if this is happening often, that might be a sign of some kidney issues. I've had one of them in my lifetime, not a very fun process by any means. Um, it takes a while to get down to the bladder. Once it's in the bladder and moving through the urethra, which is where you would think that would be the painful part, it was actually the movement from kidney to from kidney through the ureters to the bladder that was all the pain. All right, and then renal failure. This is where the kidney cannot function anymore. This is really, really problem because it affects almost all body systems because you're not removing the waste. As we saw, we're filtering 180 liters of fluid, but we're only actually getting rid of 2 liters of waste. And even though it's just 2 liters of waste, our body is really pumping that minute concentrations out. And like I've said, if you know anything about dialysis, it's a huge, huge pain. It's multiple hours a day, and that's for people that don't have functional kidneys. They have to get their blood purified, and they're spending a lot of time in the hospital or in a facility just purifying the blood. So that's how important our kidneys are. And so this is what happens as we age. There's an increased likelihood of the renal calculi and kidney stones. And the reason for this is we're no longer able to regulate the salt balance as much. So think calcium regulation, and that's because our body starts to have a decreased response to PTH, which of course we know is what helps reabsorb calcium. So if that calcium doesn't get reabsorbed, it's forming in the kidney, right? And so that can end up happening. We have a decreased number in the functional nephrons. Now, notice there's a big gap. In 60 years, we decrease about 33%. I just kind of stuck in the middle there. And of course, what this results in is lessened ability to regulate your body fluid and your blood pressure. And that's why people tend to have blood pressure problems as they age, is your nephrons aren't doing their job as regularly. And then there's also a reduction in GFR. So you have less glomeruli to actually produce and filtrate. All right. You have a reduced sensitivity to ADH. So where you're supposed to be conserving water, you no longer are. And so that's why often there's more frequent bathroom breaks, especially at night during the when you're sleeping. But basically, more water and more sodium loss ends up happening. All right, and then your urinary reflex sensitivity starts to be disrupted, which that can be a loss of external sphincter muscle tone, which could of course lead to like little drips. Um, Laughing and maybe having minor accidents and things like that can end up happening as you age. And oftentimes, when you get really, really old, you might end up having to be in a diaper because, of course, really controlling it can get lost further and further. All right, but These things, of course, when you have stroke, Alzheimer's, other central nervous system problems, they can severely end up impacting this even more greatly. All right, but males only also can have prostatic enlargement, and that will compress the urethra, which makes it difficult to pass urine. Oftentimes, the urine won't get all the way out. So, some of the complexities with aging, and in most cases, I think when you think about aging as a whole, if you know what the urinary system does, it's pretty much it's no longer able to do those things as we see here. All right, but that closes out this chapter. Chapter 26 is done. Our first chapter of the unit is done. We've still got a ways to go. We got the reproductive system to get through, which is kind of exciting because it's the only system where it varies from male to female. All the other systems are pretty much spot on, almost exactly identical, minus relative size of the organs. But the male and female reproductive system, really unique because it's the only system that technically we don't need to survive, and technically varies from one organism to the other. Now, I know I said don't need it to survive. Obviously, we need it for a species to survive, but it's actually one of the only systems that doesn't necessarily contribute to homeostasis in the common sense of homeostasis, like regulating blood pressure, etc. But we'll talk about that more in chapter 28. So we'll see you at chapter 28. Thank you all for listening. And yes, we are skipping chapter 27. Chapter 27 is the one we'll close out with. All right, but thank you all for listening. Look out for the upcoming chapter 28 lecture. We'll see you there, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions.